Thank you, Neil, and good morning to all of you. Look around you. You have an incredibly diverse group of colleagues from around the world. We're going to have a very interesting morning with lots of things happening during this opening plenary. But perhaps the place to start is, for the first time in human history, we collectively, the nations of this world, working with civil society and the private sector, have adopted a common framework that will shape the nature of human well-being through 2030. And this enables us, under national plans and other approaches, to build on the Millennium Development Goals and to take on, in essence, the challenge of our generation, of generations, of eliminating extreme poverty once and for all. But many challenges remain, and how do we adopt this framework and implement it in some of the world's most complicated environments, fragile states or places in conflict, will be perhaps, hopefully not the Achilles heel of the SDGs, but in many ways the place where we have to focus our energies. Our first speaker needs perhaps no introduction. Jeff Sachs is a world-renowned economist, leader in sustainable development, UN advisor, best-selling author. If you haven't read at least one of his books, I guess his latest book is The Age of Sustainable Development, which came out last year. He has, in essence, been a champion for issues on addressing political and economic injustice, the whole challenge of persistent extreme poverty. He serves as a professor, director of the Earth Institute, the Nikula Professor of Sustainable Development, Professor of Health Policy and Management at Columbia University. I think I first met Jeff perhaps 20 years ago. I know that he's been a deep friend of the NGO community, serving both as an advisor to the current Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, and then earlier on the FDGs, on the MDGs. It is a pleasure to welcome Jeff Sachs to open our conference. Thank you, Jeff, and welcome.
Good morning, friends. Neil and Sam, thank you for your remarkable leadership, which is every day, not only at this forum, but thank you for bringing together world leaders in humanitarian, social justice, and development causes. It's really a profound privilege for me to be here and to have the chance to share a few moments of thoughts with you. And there really are lots of heroes in this room. I was sitting across from Helene Gayle, who's one of the world's heroes in this area, and Chris Giles, and many, many other friends and wonderful people around the room. So before I say anything else, I want to say thank you, and thank you for the chance to start. I'm going to give a little bit of a heavy talk, I'm afraid, because it's a heavy time. It's not as simple as we would like. The emergencies are pervasive, and the violence is ever present in almost all parts of the world, and of course in areas where all of you are very bravely working. And we lose aid workers every day, and we lose vast numbers of innocents every day these days. And I want to talk about that because I believe that it is really a root issue for us in facing up to our challenges. And I gave my talk title as Peace is the Solution to Development, and Development is the name for peace. Of course, you'll recognize Pope Paul VI's statement in Populorum Progressio, that development is the new name for peace, which he said in 1967, meaning that if we could achieve development, we would reduce the conflicts. I also want to emphasize today that by ending the conflicts, we have a chance for development, which we don't have right now as long as these conflicts rage, because we cannot stay ahead of them. Pope Francis went to Lesbos to meet migrant refugees desperately fleeing for their lives. This Saturday, I was in the Vatican this weekend. The mood was indeed very, very heavy because of the amount of war around and the scale of the plight that we face. The Syrian crisis is absolutely shocking. There are 10 million Syrians displaced. Nobody has a precisely accurate count, but it is more than 400,000 dead. OCHA this year has called for $7.6 billion. I'm going to come back to that number in just a moment. It has not been heeded. And of course, everywhere Syria is displacing development aid. The emergency is crowding out the long-term important aid. Even in the world's best and most reliable donor countries of Scandinavia, the Syrian crisis is cutting deeply into development assistance this year. This is the world's most virulent and violent humanitarian crisis of our moment, and it is a crisis that is right before us a month before we meet again in Istanbul at the first ever World Humanitarian Summit. There are many things shocking about the scale of this crisis and those numbers that I just showed you. One of them is that just the UN agency appeal this year alone is for $7.7 billion, of which what has been received is $700 million. Both of these are really worth noting for a moment. The scale of the challenge and the inadequacy of the response are both telltale signs of the Syrian crisis and of our way in the world these days. It's notable that the UN request this year for Syrian emergency, the $7.7 billion, is greater than the total worldwide official development assistance for primary, secondary, and early childhood education. So if you want to think about how the work of development gets crowded out, wars are expensive, they're disasters, and they crowd out what all of us are trying to do every day. And if that appeal is met, it means more than the entire development budget for education at these levels. And if it's not met, of course, it means suffering and tragedy for the refugees and the displaced people. I want to give some historical background because I think we are deeply on the wrong track. In my opinion, these are wars of choice, and very bad wars, very bad choices. And it is our job, I believe, as citizens and as leaders of humanitarian efforts to speak clearly about these bad choices and about what we need to do to make better choices. It happens I can start exactly a century ago with Mr. Sir Mark Sykes and Georges-François Picot, who 100 years ago this month signed the Sykes-Picot Treaty. This was the secret negotiation between the British Empire and the French Empire to divide what they anticipated to be the carcass of the Ottoman Empire at the end of World War I. And this, 100 years later, is the root of today's crisis. Because as they penciled that document, in secret, of course, as so many of our crucial documents are in secret today, they drew a map and they created their zones of control. And the British got most of it, but they left Syria and Lebanon to France. Britain was very, very careful to take Mosul and the identified oil fields and to claim control over Palestine, where it intended to create British control in order to protect the flanks of the Suez Canal. That map is the fighting field today. Governance was never permitted locally, and it's been 100 years of great power machinations in this region until this very day. This is literally our war zone. I made a short list. This is just a few of the greatest hits of the last 100 years. Otherwise, it would have been pages and pages and pages. But in 1915, in the Hussein-McMahon letters, Britain made the promise for Arabian independence at the end of World War I. Turned out Britain ended up promising the same thing to everybody. That was their trick. They expected to keep it for themselves in the end, but they promised the land to the Arabs, they promised the land to the Jews, they promised the land to the French, but they certainly never had in mind self-governance. Then in May 1916, the Sykes-Picot Treaty was ratified. 1917, the British Empire announced the Balfour Declaration. 1920, Britain began its suppression of local governance with the aerial attacks in Iraq to put down an Iraqi rebellion. 1925, Britain backed the Wahhabist House of Saud to defeat the Hashemite kingdom that ruled over the Hejaz, because the Hejaz and the Hashemites were saying, we don't really like British encroachment so much in this area. And that was the end of the Hashemite control on the way to Saudi Arabia. And if you know the history, Britain sided with what was called the Ikhwan, the Brotherhood. That was the jihadist, Sunni jihadist movement of its day, the Al-Qaeda early ancestor, to topple the Hejaz and to go on for a Wahhabist state in the Arabian Peninsula under British suzerainty. In 1932, the Wahhabist state was formed. That means deliberately empowering a quite extreme sect of Islam in order to have a state that the empire could control. I've skipped a lot, but I'll just move forward. In 1947, the CIA was founded. It was established for two reasons: one, as an intelligence agency, and second, as a secret army of the President of the United States, to carry out secret army covert operations, especially toppling governments. It just took them about 18 months before they toppled their first government in Syria, ending the Syrian democracy in the 1949 Syrian coup. That worked so well that 4 years later they toppled Mossadegh in Iran, when he had the temerity to suggest that Iran's oil might belong to Iran, not to Britain. That was the end of him. Skipping ahead, in 1979, the CIA supported Osama bin Laden to establish a base, Al-Qaeda in Arabic, of operations for the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. And we supported a Sunni jihad, just like Britain had done repeatedly. In 1980, the CIA sent weapons to Saddam Hussein to fight the Iranians for 7 years. In 1998, President Clinton signed the Iraq Liberation Act calling for regime change in Syria 5 years before the war started. In 2003, following the Iraq Liberation Act, the US launched its war on Iraq. In 2011, the US launched its war on Syria to overthrow the Assad regime. It also launched a war, I failed to mention it, the war, NATO launched its war, actually it's not NATO launched the war on Syria, it meant to say NATO launches the war on Libya, excuse me. At the behest of President Sarkozy, NATO bombed Libya till Gaddafi was dead, and they thought that they would place a stable regime, which hasn't come till today. In the same months, the US organized a regime change operation for Syria, and in August 2011 made it public, saying that Assad had to go, and organized support for what then was called the Free Syrian Army and the Friends of Syria. But it was a typical CIA, Saudi Arabia, Turkish operation to overthrow the Assad government. That was 5 years ago. 400,000 people dead since then. In 2013, President Obama gave a secret order to the CIA to partner with Saudi Arabia, where Saudi Arabia would pay for the arms and the CIA would train and distribute the arms to jihadists in Syria. That's the root of this crisis. This is the meddling that makes it impossible for governance to take place in the region. The countries in green are where the US has military bases. You can see why Syria is such an affront. If you happen to play the game of Risk, it's like leaving one piece off the board. You have one country in the midst of your whole territory. Well, the US has bases everywhere in the region: Kenya, Ethiopia, Yemen, Oman, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Iraq, Turkey, Pakistan, Afghanistan, but not in Syria, the little white corner up there on the map. And that was what 2011 was designed to change, unfortunately. It's not so easy to do because Syria has allies, Russia and Iran. And so what the security establishment promised the President of the United States, that this would be a quick operation, has been 5 years of mass bloodshed. Nothing quick about it. 10 million people displaced since that effort started in the spring of 2011. We pay a fortune for this. We pay a fortune for this. For the bases in nearly 70 countries, for unending war in the Middle East. I took the budget for 2017, and if you look at the military programs, defense, national intelligence, the nuclear part of DOE, Homeland Security, Veterans Affairs, and other defense-related civil programs, it's $941 billion for FY 2017. $941 billion. For international assistance programs, $27 billion. Look at the other areas: EPA, NASA, National Science Foundation. A couple days of Pentagon spending for each of those. The ratio of military-related spending to development spending in our country is now 31 times. That's astounding, ladies and gentlemen. This is not making America safe. This is not achieving security. We are overspending on our foreign policy 31 times more for the military than for development, peaceful development assistance. And these wars of choice have cost a fortune. Not that we ever see the bills really laid out, but repeated studies have shown the Iraq war is at least $2 trillion, the Afghan war at least $1 trillion, the Middle East deployments priceless, as they say in the ads. We have no idea, because it's so much of our overall military effort. And what about how this stacks up for the world? Today, there's an absolutely fantasy op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, not for the first time. Typical, but an absolute fantasy by somebody named Mark Halperin. I had to check who this expert on foreign policy was, talking about ignoring rising military dangers. It turns out he's a novelist, which is perfectly fitting. And he writes that Russia, China, and Iran have been racing ahead, stimulated by a disintegrating Europe that neither spends sufficiently on its defense nor defends its borders, and by an America strategically blind in the Middle East that failed to replenish and keep current its military under President George W. Bush, and now surrenders, apologizes, bluffs, leads from behind, and denigrates its military capacities and morale as President Obama either embraces enemies or opposes them with exquisite delicacy. This will get us all killed. This absolutely will get us all killed. This disgusting kind of daily drumbeat for war and military spending. The truth is, as the Swedish Institute SIPRI shows, the United States is spending 36% of the entire world military budget. The next country behind is China at 13%. Russia, that they're so afraid of, that Halperin is so afraid of, 4%. Iran doesn't even make this graph. This is the propaganda that drives us to the never-ending wars. And we're wasting trillions and trillions of dollars and then begging for tiny amounts for desperately poor people, or to fund the fight against polio or the fight against malaria, or community health workers begging and not even getting the money that is needed. The United States, as you know, remains dreadfully just at the bottom of ODA as a share of gross national income. Now it's 0.18% of our GDP, while the military spending you saw is nearly 10% when you add up all the components. We can't even manage 0.2% anymore. And here's what's happened to our ODA as a share of GNI. During the Kennedy years, it was about 0.6. As Kennedy said, we will bear any burden to help the people in the villages and huts around the globe to help them help themselves. And then Vietnam crowded it out, and then Nixon cut it further. Then it stabilized under President Carter and President Reagan, President Bush, and then under President Clinton, it reached the lowest level in our history, 0.1% in 1998. Basically, it collapsed. President Bush restored it a bit with PEPFAR and PMI and other programs joining the Global Fund, and then President Obama now has presided over a return to decline in the latest year. So we're spending a fortune on the wars, and we are absolutely, as a nation, not spending on development assistance. Let me conclude with some operational recommendations that meet the scale of the challenge. The first is to reduce the U.S. military budget by $100 billion and transfer that sum to official development assistance, global climate financing, and R&D for sustainable development. If you want us to be safe, we have to invest in our safety. The military is making us dangerous for the whole world. We have to invest in our safety. Second, we need to revise the National Security Act of 1947. There is no place in a safe world for a secret presidential army. The CIA coups and destabilization and overthrows and secret arms transactions all over the Middle East have gotten us to where we are today. We need to end a foreign policy based on regime change. That is deciding Gaddafi has to go, Assad has to go, Saddam Hussein has to go, Mossadegh has to go. No country can be stable if another country is overthrowing their governments. And then we turn around and we say all the time, why can't the Middle East govern itself? They're just not ready for democracy. Try having a democracy. It'll probably last a blink of an eye before somebody comes in to overthrow it. Let's get real and honest about what it will take to have homegrown democracy. We now have a UN Security Council resolution for a ceasefire in Syria. Please raise your voices to enforce this. And please understand what the root of the problem has been since 2011. The United States launched a regime change to overthrow Assad. Russia and Iran have backed Assad. Then we say, how dare they back the one we're trying to overthrow? And so all the time you read in our mainstream media, look at how Russia's intervening because they're objecting to our regime change operation. In 2012, there was a ceasefire negotiated by Kofi Annan, but the US said no because it included allowing Assad to stay in power for some time. And so the US said no to it. Now we're 300,000 dead since that moment. And who funds the jihadists? Believe me, the money's coming from Saudi Arabia. It's coming from throughout the Persian Gulf. That's not just happening. This is by design. And those are our allies. So I read in the newspaper. Well, we have some influence because they depend on us for billions of dollars of arms sales. We could stop the flow of funding to these jihadists if we agreed to stop the war. We can stop the war if we stop insisting that unilateral regime change by the US outside of the UN is our foreign policy. We need to promote the Sustainable Development Goals. That's the real reason we're here. I just had to give a prelude to say why we're not achieving them. We're not achieving them because we're not funding them. We're not investing in health and education, in disease control. We easily could. The main lesson of public health in the last 15 years is you put money towards any good thing and it will work. It's the most brilliant profession, public health. Real operational, algorithmic, practical, science-based approaches to control disease and disease burden. But we don't invest adequately in it. These Sustainable Development Goals are for the United States internally as much as they are for the United States internationally. We can't even keep safe water in our cities anymore. We need SDG 6 for Flint and for dozens of other cities. We need SDG 4, quality education for young people all over this country with $1 trillion of public student debt. We need decent jobs for young people, SDG 8. We need sustainable cities, SDG 11, and of course we need to decarbonize our energy system, SDG 13. We need to come to the World Humanitarian Summit next month with purpose. Not just cleaning up after the mess of the belligerents and the militarists, but telling them to stop these horrific wars of choice. And I want to thank you and beg you to continue your role because it is essential and no one else can do it but you. The NGO community must continue to bear witness to the suffering and the abuses of power that I've been discussing, to spread the word about sustainable development because your task is fundamentally a task of education, education of the world, and of course to help the neediest among us. Thank you very much.